We massively underestimate how much people like to be asked deep questions. If I ask you, I was wondering if you could tell me, how do you think you're going to die? Or when is the last time you felt real joy in your life? Most people think that no one wants to answer that. People love answering those questions.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Kurt Gray is the Weary Foundation Endowed Chair of Social Psychology at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. He directs the Deepest Belief Lab, which explores the psychology of morality, politics, and religion, and AI, and also directs the Collaboration for the Science of Polarization and Misinformation, C-SPAM, I believe it's called. Welcome to Voices, Dr. Gray.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I want to ask more about C-SPAM later, but I want to begin first with the book you've published called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Tell us about the main argument of the book, or the main findings.
You bet. I mean, no one's a stranger to outrage and political division in the country today. And the book offers a kind of new understanding of why we fight, and I think one that's grounded in the latest science about how our minds work. And the argument's pretty simple. It is that the reason that we disagree so much and we get so angry isn't because, we're evil or the other side is evil or stupid. It's really that we're all focused on protecting ourselves and our families and our communities from harm. But what you see as harmful might differ from what someone else might see as harmful. And those kind of disagreements about these perceptions of harm, these assumptions about what's going to protect us versus what's going to be harmful for the country, right? That's what's driving disagreement, not because we have fundamentally different kind of moral minds. We have the same moral mind. We just see harms differently.
How did you come to this conclusion? What was your methodology?
A lot of studies. So, my lab and I, we've published over 140 papers. A lot of those are about morality. But a lot of the core methodology is really asking people to make moral judgments about all sorts of different things. So we've got hot button topics, abortion, immigration, and we've got weird kind of thought experiments that we get people to make moral judgments about. Some of them are grounded in reality, and some of them are a little more far-fetched. But these are thought experiments where some people might say they're harmless, whereas other people, I argue, see real harm. And so based on how people make and we can get into those, and based on how people make these judgments, I can see that really what drives their moral condemnation are these concerns about harm. Even if you don't see the harm, what someone else sees as wrong, they see it as wrong because they see it as harmful.
Tell us about some of these thought experiments. Let's dive into it.
Sure. I mean, we can even go for a real example that stemmed from a conversation I had with a philosopher years ago at a conference. But we were arguing about, whether these concerns about harm really drive all our moral judgments. And he says it can't be the case because people condemn harmless wrongs. And I say, that's not true. That's not true. If you condemn it, it's because you see it as harmful. You just perhaps, as a philosopher, and philosophers have weird moral intuitions, don't see the harm. And he said, that can't be true because my mom, she thinks that the Barnes collection moving is wrong, but it's harmless. What's the Barnes collection? It's a museum in Philadelphia. And this industrialist made a ton of money. He bought a ton of art. He had it at his house in the suburbs. And he said, the only way that we can have this museum open is by keeping it at my house in the suburbs. Turns out the house in the suburbs was a real pain to get to, right? It was too small. It wasn't great for many ways. And so the foundation moved the Barnes collection into the city, downtown. There was some outrage about this, right? This was in his will. And you're not doing what he said. And he says, look, my mom thinks this is totally wrong, but it's harmless. And I said, that's not true. I don't know your mom, but she thinks it's harmful if she says it's wrong. And he says, well, I guess it's your word against mine. And I said, no, let's phone your mom.
Seriously.
So we're at the bar. It's like 9:30 at night. Well, let's do it, And so,
empiricism.
Yeah, right. This is what science is all about. You can even do science after a couple drinks. And so he phones his mom, like the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire kind of thing, right? Hey, Mom. And she's like, is everything okay? I know you're at a conference. Everything's fine. I'm talking here. We've got a question. And as the mom of a philosopher, I think she's used to some weird questions. And to his credit, he does a really good job. Doesn't lead the witness. He says, Mom, the Barnes collection? Yeah, absolutely. You know what you think about that, right? Yeah, I think it's wrong. Now, here's a question for you, Mom. Do you think what's happening is harmful? And she says, absolutely. Right? It's harmful because it harms everyone who wants their wishes respected after they're dead. It's harmful to the kind of spirit of Mr. Barnes, right? It's harmful to society because if we don't follow the promises that we make to each other, right, what's going to happen? And so these intuitions of what's harmful really powerfully drive our moral judgments, even if other people disagree with our perceptions of harm.
So it's interesting that you said you're having this debate with a philosopher, because you began by saying that you're wrestling with issues of morality. The thought in my head is, well, you're talking about philosophy. This is what philosophers do. What is it that you do as a social psychologist? How is your approach different than the philosopher? How do you come to different conclusions than the philosopher?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I, as a psychologist, study what people think and really feel about morality, everyday people, their sense of right or wrong, their moral outrage. And that is really different from what philosophers say we ought to do. So a simple way is that I study what morality is in the brain, in the mind, and philosophers or theologians or your pastor, right, they study what morality ought to be. They say, here's what we should aspire to be. I don't have such lofty goals as that. I say, well, here's how people make their moral judgment. Here's how the mind works.
How did you come to see harm perception as the central engine of outrage?
Yeah, I should say from the outset that this wasn't like my pet hypothesis that I was hoping to show was the master key of morality, is what I argue in the book. I was actually doing some other work about how people make sense of the minds of others. Does your dog have a mind? You probably think so, but I think probably not as much as you think so, right? So we disagree about, the minds that each of us have. And in large part, our moral disagreements about a lot of things, like a fetus or a dog or a cow, hinge on how much mind we perceive, right? Whether those entities can be harmed. If you think a fetus has a mind, can feel pain, then it can be harmed, right? So growing out of this understanding of how do we make sense of other minds, this kind of idea of like harm just kind of popped up, right? We want to protect things from harm, like animals, like fetuses, like our children. And so the more research I did, the more I just saw it kind of popping up everywhere. But it wasn't popping up in a kind of, let's really rationalize our moral judgment. It was popping up in this powerful way that like, if you saw something as wrong, it's because of this like deep visceral feeling that something's harmful. So I'll give you another example. Anita Bryant was
from the 70s.
That's
I'm
right.
Thinking, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, was a country western singer and the face of Florida orange juice.
That's what I remember. Yes.
That's right. A day without orange juice is a day without sunshine.
Yes.
She was also a really aggressive gay rights opponent.
I remember that as well. Yes.
And so she really sacrificed her entire career. Right, she was blackballed everywhere.
I'd forgotten that she was a country singer.
Yeah, that's right. Because she so strongly was opposed to the advance of gay rights. And she said, look, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but said something like, well, if nothing's stopping us from saying, like, let's have gay rights in the street, what's stopping us from saying, let's support the murderer, let's support, the burglar. And so she saw a lot of harm in allowing gay folks to have rights and marry. And she told this story in her mind of like, well, here's what's going to happen. Gay folks are are going to start to kind of like get together. They're not going to have kids. Other people will see that their lifestyle is kind of fabulous. They don't have to pay for daycare. Wouldn't that be nice? And then people won't have kids. The family will fall apart. Nuclear wasteland, and there's a bit of an ellipse between, people not having kids to nuclear wasteland.
Logical leap.
That's right. But it doesn't mean that people don't perceive it, right? And so she so strongly perceived it that she sacrificed her career. And this kind of story came up again and again. It's like really these deep-seated concerns about harm and suffering, even if they're not rational, even if a philosopher might say they're not right? They're still motivating people's behavior and their outrage.
Where does that sense come from? I mean, is that something hardwired in me, the sense of harm? Where does that come from?
It's absolutely hardwired. We evolved as a species. All species evolved to protect themselves. Right? There's not a species out there that thinks it's a great idea to like walk up to a predator and say, "Eat me," right? Because the genes wouldn't be passed on, right? It wouldn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. And so humans have evolved for millions of years really worried about threats, right? If you're in the woods, right, and you hear a twig snap, you're going to wonder, what is that, right? You're going to be worried. And I think this evolutionary legacy has not been fully appreciated by science, right? So there's this idea that humans are apex predators, and sure, today we can hunt wolves from helicopters with high-powered rifles. It's not how it was for most of our years of evolution. And so for a large part, in the book, the beginning of it, I argue that the first thing you need to understand is that human nature is more prey than predator. I mean, look at your fingernails. These are not the claws of a predator. When I look at my cat, I think that is a predator,
I have the scars to prove it.
Exactly. And so we live in groups to protect ourselves. I often encourage people, if you really want to know how it feels like to be prey, take off your clothes and go to a forest at dusk, right? You're not going to be like, oh, I'm an apex predator. I can't wait to eat something. You think something's going to eat me, right? And so this understanding that we are more prey than predator really feeds into our understanding of where a moral outrage comes from. It comes from a sense of threat, of being attacked, and of really understanding that if we don't have a strong group to protect us and we don't follow the rules of the group, then something bad is going to happen.
So harm perception, harm protection. What does this imply for how we approach political debates?
So political debates are really about competing divisions. So political debates are really about competing visions about what harms we should worry about in our country and in our communities. So folks on the left and folks on the right are both fixated on protecting themselves and our country. But the visions that, let's say, Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris kind of put forth in the last election are very different about what the threats perhaps are, and even who might be emphasizing more threats than the other, right? And so we need to think about political debates as really debates about what threats are out there and how do we best deal with those threats.
In your book, you say that facts are the wrong kind of things to change minds in both moral and political disagreements. So what are facts doing in these conversations if they're not persuading?
Like listeners to maybe think about the last time they had a conversation about morality and politics and either used facts or listened to facts and then thought, you know what? I'm wrong. I guess I'll give up my moral convictions. Or the person they were talking with says, oh my goodness, this factoid you heard on NPR or Fox News, I never knew that. I guess I'll give up my moral beliefs, right? That never happens.
No.
And the reason it never happens is because we are not fine-tuned for facts. Our minds revolve around stories. And, I've taught statistics before to undergrads. It's a real pain to teach people statistics. It takes a long time to get them to appreciate what statistics even are. I can read my kids a story. As soon as they understand English, they can understand a story. And so our minds are really storytelling and story listening machines. And so if you see a news report about this threat is in your basement, or this threat's coming over the border, or this threat, whatever, right, you're going to think, oh my goodness, it's a threat. And if that corresponds with your political ideology, it's going to be so powerful that all the facts in the world will not convince you. In fact, those facts will seem fake because statistics are squishy, right? But stories somehow seem powerful in our minds.
So you're not suggesting that stories are fake or stories are falsehoods or the opposite of facts? Or maybe you are.
No, stories are not necessarily the opposite of facts, but they are, certainly when I teach psychology, we argue that stories are not a reasonable basis upon which to make conclusions about how the mind works, how the world is, or the kinds of policies that we should have in the country, right? We want data for that. Right. But the problem with data is that, you can see it from different perspectives. The control condition is ambiguous, right? There's always interpretation difficulties with data. And that's why it's so hard. This is why you need PhDs, to do the science of statistics. You don't need a PhD to understand a story. And so if someone tells you, look, immigrants are being detained at the border, kids are suffering, or immigrants are coming up through the border illegally and they're hurting U.S. citizens, right? You can have a real story that exemplifies real suffering, showing completely opposite, perspectives, and they will stick more in your mind than some kind of statistic or fact.
So you're not saying that, like in university, we shouldn't be trafficking in facts, or that we need to give everything over to stories. You're not suggesting that.
Absolutely not. I'm a scientist, right? Everything I do is about facts. I mean, everything in the book is a fact.
Right.
But I don't only present facts, right? Because I know how our mind works, and I know that stories are powerful, right? So if you look at a newspaper article, it'll almost always start with a story.
Yeah.
It was a windy Tuesday, and I walked across campus, and I wondered, what would we be talking about today? And then you could go into the facts. It's just hard to really talk to someone about anything we care about without having to resort to stories in some ways.
So a key part of your book is about finding common ground in a polarized environment. How is this accomplished? What sort of advice do you give in the book?
Well, it's not easy. I'll say that right up front.
I was hoping it'd be easy.
Well, maybe it is. It's an easy solution, but it's hard to implement, let's say. So I've got some easy tips. Perhaps the first is in conversations, don't try to win. I often say that if you try to win, then you've already lost. And I think we can all appreciate this from our own perspective when someone tries to argue with us. You are at Thanksgiving or Christmas or on the bus, on the phone, you're talking about politics, and you're just exhausted when someone's trying to convince you that your own moral convictions are wrong. But imagine how it feels from the other person's perspective, right? If you're not willing to change your beliefs, why are they willing to change their beliefs? And so I think, we should approach these conversations from a truce that really we're just trying to understand each other and kind of foster our relationship and not trying to win. And so with that mindset, I've got 3 easy tips, I think, that are helpful for having better conversations. And these tips come out of my work in conversations with all sorts of practitioners. So there's an organization called Essential Partners. They're in Boston. They have been around for over 4 decades and help people have conversations in really divided communities, like after a shooting, after war. We're talking, right, intense things. And so if they can bridge divides in those situations, then you can use their tips for a better Thanksgiving dinner. So here they are. An easy framework for thinking of them is CIV, the beginning of civil conversations. So the first one is connect. And what that means is before you launch into a tirade about politics, you want to connect with someone as a human being, right? We're so much richer than our politics. We like music or, pets, vacations, whatever. So you can ask about that. And I think the really interesting thing here, and this connects to some research done by this professor at University of Chicago named Nick Epley, is that we massively underestimate how much people like to be asked questions, deep questions. So if I ask you, I was wondering if you could tell me, how do you think you're going to die? Or when is the last time you felt real joy in your life? Most people think that no one wants to answer that. People love answering those questions, these deep questions. Like there's only so many times you can ask, how about this weather, right? How about those Buckeyes? People have talking about sports and weather, but what they really want to talk about in this kind of fractured era is a chance to connect. So you connect with these deep questions, right? Really get to the heart of who somebody is. And then after C is the I, you invite them to share their beliefs. Now, I doesn't mean inquisition. It doesn't mean forcing them to talk. You might say, look, I know we maybe, voted differently in the last election. Maybe now is not the right time to talk about it. I just love to hear, setting aside all the sound bites and factoids from cable news, kind of your perspective on immigration or where you're coming from with abortion. I just like to understand where you're coming from. That's an incredible invitation, right? Mm-hmm. People are excited to share. But I got an email from someone in Western Australia who read the book, and she said, look, this invitation doesn't work. I tried it. It doesn't work. And I said, well, how'd you invite? And she said, look, my neighbor is kind of different, for me politically. And we were talking about Israel and Gaza and Palestine. And I said to him, look, I don't know how you can support this. Justify to me how you can support genocide.
That's the wrong question.
Yeah, that's right. That's not an invitation, right? It's not an invitation. And so an invitation has to be a sincere attempt to understand, right? To really open and be open to someone's perspective. So you invite them, great. And then the V is validation. They tell you what they're thinking. And, think back to the idea that we're prey. If they share their perspective in a kind of fractured, intense, polarized environment, it's like they're baring their neck to you in some ways. They're telling you their deepest thoughts and feelings, and now you have a chance to kind of attack them, or I think take the high road and foster understanding and have more civil conversations is to say, thanks for sharing that. I know it was hard to put into words, and I know there's a lot of kind of like talking around both sides, a lot of angry insults. So I just appreciate you, telling me. And I, of course we disagree about a lot of things, but it's helpful for me to kind of see where you're coming from, right? That goes so far in having conversations. And none of this means you give up your convictions, and none of this means you don't vote for your candidate, right? Or don't give money to who you want to give to. But it's that you are trying to understand where someone's coming from, and that can not only build better conversations, but maybe years later you can end up convincing them about your views because now you actually understand where they're coming from.
As someone who has the opportunity to ask deep questions, I'm wondering about the kinds of settings in which people can ask these sorts of questions. It seems to me there's very little opportunity, or people very rarely take the opportunity to ask questions. They'd rather make statements. What are the forums or what are the settings in which people can ask questions?
Great question. It turns out that you can ask these questions almost anywhere, even if you feel awkward about it.
So you don't need a microphone. You don't need a podcast.
Well, here's the study. This is why I love this study so much. They got people who are taking the train from the suburbs of Chicago into the city. So these are commuters. And they asked people, do you think you and other people would rather just sit there in silence listening to a podcast like this one, right? Or just absentmindedly looking at your phone, or would you rather talk to a stranger about really deep, important things? And they're like, are you insane? Obviously, listen to a podcast or just being on my phone, right? In solitude. And so they said, well, too bad. Half of you need to have a conversation with a stranger. And some of these people see these people every day. You're like, oh, there's the guy with a hat on the train, whatever. And so you're sitting next to him, and they turn to this person and says, look, I'm doing this study. Can I ask you a question? And most people say, sure. And then they go, when's the last time you felt joy? What's the value you want to pass on to the next generation? These like deep, deep questions. And people think, that's a little weird. But I'm actually grateful for the chance to connect. And then when they ask them to complete this survey after the conversation, put it in the mail and send it back, when they collect all those data, they show those data that people had a way better time asking those questions than they thought. And so the answer is you can do it anywhere. Like green eggs and ham. You can do it on a boat, in a train, in the rain, with a mouse in a house, right? You can do it wherever. Just take the leap to actually ask a question.
I wonder if if they've been educated or trained even to know how to ask questions.
Yeah.
It's certainly not part of schooling.
That's right.
Give us answers, we tell kids.
That's
not
right.
Formulate questions.
That's right. Listening is hard.
Yeah.
Listening is hard. I guess I want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be this huge, huge bar, right? You can just look online and get some questions. I even ask questions sarcastically. I'm not a sincere person, and I still get good answers. So I had a colleague, we were walking to a faculty meeting, and I said, "So, are you feeling incredibly self-actualized today?" And obviously the answer is no. I look sleep-deprived. But that was enough to break him out of his thoughts and to talk about why he was not feeling incredibly self-actualized. If you say, "How you doing?" people say, "Well, fine."
Yeah.
But if you mix it up a little bit, right? Have you ever been convicted of a crime for which you have not received a pardon, which is something I had to answer when I applied for my green card, right? That's a funny question to ask someone. And so there's all sorts of questions you could ask. I remember going to the bar when I was young, and someone was trying out a pickup line, and someone says, "What would your second wish be if you got a magic lamp?" That's a weird question. I didn't have a good answer, but it made me think, and and it just kicked off the conversation. So it can be a weird question. You just have to take the leap.
Well, let me ask you another question. Tell us about the Deepest Beliefs Lab. I love the title.
Thank you. It took a while to think about it, and there's so many different things that I study and my students study, and I wanted a kind of all-encompassing title. And I think this does it best because we study people's deepest beliefs. And the logo of the lab, which I also worked hard on, is this flame at the middle of a maze. And, those are our beliefs kind of animating and fueling who we are and how we act. But it can take a while to get to them, to really figure out how to study them. That's the scientific challenge or puzzle that I engage with every day in my lab. And so we take for granted that, of course, I have deep moral convictions or political convictions. But how do we actually study those, figure out what they are, and figure out how they connect? That's the work that my lab does.
Are the students in the lab, are they all psychology majors? Are they philosophers?
We have a pretty wide net. I mean, obviously the grad students are in psychology because, they're my grad students, but we have folks from philosophy, we have folks from political science, we have folks from marketing.
Interesting.
Because people don't want to buy products from certain companies. There's a polarized marketplace today. Brands are grappling with these questions. Organizational behavior, folks, people get divided in work teams. And so, the study of religion, kind of have some theology and religious folks who are connected to the lab. These things matter to almost everyone. Right? Everyone has deepest beliefs, and they matter. And so it's a very open lab with a lot of collaborators.
What is the collaboration for the science of polarization and misinformation, C-SPAM?
Yeah, so I've only been at Ohio State now for about 8 months, and this is one of the things that I was hired to lead. And it was also kind of endowed by Gif Weary, whose name I bear in my title. And she was really concerned with the level of polarization and misinformation in America today, and thought that science, especially scientists at OSU, could really contribute to having an understanding of why we're divided, why there's falsehoods around that people propagate, and how we can mitigate those things. And so it's really a kind of scientific enterprise that's looking to society and hoping to impact policy and change.
To end polarization and misinformation, I hope?
Yes, exactly. Well, to reduce it, but certainly not to inflame it.
I wonder why you ended up in psychology or social psychology as opposed to some other discipline. Did you know when you were 4 years old you were going to be a psychologist?
Definitely not. So my dad was in the Canadian Navy, and I thought I wanted to be a fighter pilot.
Oh, okay.
I've got pretty good eyes. I've got great reflexes as a kid. I like speed, and I thought I could be a pilot. I was actually in the Air Cadets, and I thought I was going to get my pilot's license. And then I realized that I don't like authority. It took me a year to figure that out in the Air Cadets. And so I don't like having, corporals telling me what to do. And so I thought I would do something different. And I always liked science. And so I thought I wanted to be a geophysicist.
Oh, okay. So
I grew up in Calgary, which is the Texas of Canada. And there's beef, and there's conservatism, at least for Canada, and there's oil. And so I had a friend whose dad was a geophysicist, and he had pretty good muscles. He had a pretty beautiful girlfriend. He bow hunted. He had a freezer full of moose meat, and he used hair pomade instead of gel, which to a 16-year-old, I thought, like, this guy's the man. He's incredibly sophisticated and can also bow hunt. And so I thought, I want to be a geophysicist too. And, we had conversations about general and special relativity. He's a very, learned person. I got to the University of Waterloo. I did a year of geophysics. I didn't care about rocks. I didn't care about minerals. And then I did a work term up in northern Canada looking for natural gas. It was fun. We flew helicopters and drove snowmobiles. But I still didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. So I just switched to psychology. I mean, just kind of on a whim, but...
just like that?
Just like that. Because I think I always wanted to study how the mind works. I always wanted to study the things that are really invisible, unlike rocks, that people live and die for. But we can't really study them directly, right? We need to design all sorts of elegant studies to kind of figure out what we really believe and why we believe. And so I switched and never looked back.
What are you working on now? What's next for you in your lab?
So I'm working on a very small problem, which is, what is the nature of truth?
Oh.
Yeah. So check in a week. We'll have it solved.
You'll have that answer in a week. Great.
Easy peasy. I mean, questions about misinformation, there's a lot of work out there that's pretty applied, and I think that work is very important. Like, can you have nudges on Twitter or X to make people share less misinformation? Those are important, but I think really what gets me going as the Deepest Beliefs Lab is really understanding, what do people think about is really true, and what does truth mean to each of us? And we each kind of perceive it in our own ways, kind of like harm. And so there's all sorts of interesting things that we can think about truth and even levels of truth. Let's say someone's a flat earther. They're like, look, the earth's flat. Great. And then I say, I'm going to give you a $10,000 cruise around the world, all expenses paid. And they think, maybe I'll take the cruise, And so, how much do people really believe what they say? Are people's understandings of truth subject to change? How much are they motivated, right? How much are they driven by our political ideology or just trying to be, interesting or unique, right? All these things are important for how we make sense of truthiness.
Kurt Gray, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dengler. I'm Jen Farmer.